April 27th, 1942. The entrance to the Firth of Clyde, Scotland. Commander David Fletcher gripped the railing of the harbor patrol boat as his searchlight crew swept their beam across the roiling black water. The steel cable, hanging from the retrieval winch, dripped seawater onto the deck. Something massive strained against it 30 feet below the surface. Fletcher had commanded harbor defenses for 8 months, and he'd seen fouled nets before. Fishing trawlers, debris, even a wayward British submarine during training. But the tension on that cable told a different story. The winch motor screamed under the load. Whatever was down there was fighting to get free. "Pressure hull breach detected, sir." The hydrophone operator's voice cracked. "She's blowing ballast tanks." Then Fletcher's blood ran cold. Through the murky water, caught in the harsh glare of the searchlight, a gray shape emerged. The distinctive bow planes of a German Type 70C U-boat broke the surface, wrapped in 300 feet of revolutionary wire mesh that looked nothing like the heavy submarine nets protecting every other British naval installation. Fletcher's modified indicator net, the design naval architects in Portsmouth had called laughably inadequate, the mesh pattern senior officers dismissed as no stronger than herring nets, had just strangled a 750-ton U-boat hunter. The submarine wallowed helplessly, her diving planes tangled, her propeller shaft fouled with wire. 52 German submariners would surrender within the hour. What skeptics at the Admiralty didn't know was that this was the second U-boat Fletcher's ridiculous net had captured in 3 days. And 72 hours later, his revolutionary design would bag one more, forcing a complete rethinking of how the Royal Navy defended its most vital harbors for the rest of the war. For 33 months, German U-boats had been bleeding Britain white. Since September 1939, Admiral Karl Dönitz's undersea fleet had sent over 2,100 Allied merchant ships to the bottom of the Atlantic. 11 million tons of desperately needed food, fuel, weapons, and raw materials that would never reach British shores. The statistics were devastating. In March 1942 alone, U-boats sank 273,000 tons of shipping. At that rate of loss, Churchill's military planners calculated Britain had perhaps 8 months before starvation forced a negotiated peace with Hitler. The submarine menace wasn't confined to the open Atlantic. German commanders had discovered a tactical gold mine, attacking ships at the very thresholds of British harbors. Convoy escorts, exhausted after crossing the Atlantic under constant threat, typically broke formation within sight of the port. Merchant captains, believing the worst was behind them, relaxed their vigilance. U-boat commanders exploited this weakness ruthlessly. Between January and April 1942, German submarines sank 47 merchant vessels and 2 Royal Navy destroyers within 10 miles of British coastal installations. The approaches to Liverpool, Glasgow, and the Clyde estuary, the primary entry points for American war materials, had become killing grounds. The Royal Navy's standard defense against submarine penetration had been developed during the First World War. Massive anti-submarine nets constructed from 5 or 8-inch flexible steel wire rope woven into 12-foot square mesh, suspended from enormous timber balks weighing several tons each. These barriers hung from the surface to depths of 120 feet, anchored with rendering winches designed to absorb the impact of a ramming submarine. The system had theoretical merit. During World War I, no British capital ship protected by such nets had been torpedoed at anchor. But these nets suffered from crippling weaknesses that peacetime theorists had overlooked and wartime experience brutally exposed. First, the nets were extraordinarily expensive. A single 400-foot section required 8 miles of heavy wire rope and cost $12,000 to manufacture, the equivalent of 2 Spitfire fighters. Second, they were agonizingly slow to install. The net defenses at Scapa Flow, the home fleet's primary anchorage, took 14 months to complete. Third, and most critically, they required constant maintenance. Saltwater corrosion attacked the wire relentlessly. The strong currents of Scottish sea locks twisted the nets into useless tangles. Ice damage in winter and storm damage year-round meant sections had to be replaced every 4 to 6 months. Commander Ian Campbell, who supervised net defenses for the Rosyth Naval Base, documented the problem in a January 1942 report to the Admiralty. Standard submarine nets are failing at an unacceptable rate. Of 18 net sections installed September through November 1941, 11 have required complete replacement due to storm damage, corrosion, or structural failure. At current replacement rates, we cannot maintain barrier integrity. The nets had another fatal weakness that wouldn't be discovered until after the war, when captured German naval archives revealed the truth. On October 28, 1918, the German submarine UB-116 had penetrated the supposedly impregnable Scapa Flow net defenses by simply cutting through with bow-mounted shears. The boat was eventually destroyed by mines, but the net barrier itself had offered virtually no resistance. British naval intelligence never learned of this incident during the interwar period. By early 1942, the Admiralty faced an impossible equation. Britain had 53 major ports and naval installations requiring submarine net protection. Standard nets were too expensive, too slow to install, too difficult to maintain, and quite possibly too easy to defeat. Yet without effective harbor defenses, U-boats would continue hunting merchant shipping at the very gates of British ports. The men responsible for solving this problem were not the celebrated destroyer. Captains, or aircraft carrier admirals, whose names filled the newspapers. They were engineers, men like Commander David Fletcher, a 38-year-old former merchant marine officer who had studied naval architecture before the war and now commanded a harbor defense unit most senior officers considered a backwater posting. What Fletcher was about to prove was that sometimes the most important innovations come not from adding strength, but from rethinking the entire problem. The conference room at the Admiralty Building in Portsmouth was lined with charts showing the locations of submarine net defenses around the British Isles. Commander Fletcher stood before a skeptical audience of senior naval architects and staff officers, presenting his proposal for a revolutionary new net design. The problem with current nets, Fletcher explained, is that we're trying to stop a submarine with brute strength. A 750-ton U-boat moving at 6 knots submerged has tremendous momentum. Our nets must be strong enough to halt that momentum, which means heavy wire, heavy floats, heavy everything. The result is a defense that costs a fortune, takes months to install, and fails regularly. Captain Edmund Hathaway, the Admiralty's chief of harbor defenses, leaned back in his chair with undisguised contempt. So your solution is to make the nets lighter? Commander, do you understand basic physics? Fletcher pressed on. Our nets fail because submarines can cut through wire, sir. German U-boats are equipped with bow shears specifically designed to sever cables up to 3/4 of an inch thick. But what they can't cut easily is mesh. Specifically, 3/8 inch flexible steel wire woven into a much finer pattern, 6-foot squares instead of 12. Herring nets, Hathaway interrupted. You want to defend His Majesty's harbors with glorified fishing nets. The finer mesh tangles the submarine's dive planes and propeller shaft, Fletcher continued, his voice tight. Instead of presenting a single cable to cut, the submarine encounters hundreds of crossing wires, each individually too light to stop the boat, but collectively forming a web that fouls every moving surface. The senior officers exchanged glances. Commander Phillips, from the Materials Research Division, shook his head. Commander Fletcher, We've tested lighter nets. They fail under stress. A submarine pushes through them like they're not even there. That's because you tested them hung statically from heavy buoys, Fletcher countered. My design uses a yielding system, rendering winches with hydraulic governors that feed out cable under strain. The net gives way, absorbing momentum instead of resisting it, while the fine mesh progressively tangles the submarine's control surfaces and propulsion. Hathaway stood up, signaling the meeting's end. Gentlemen, I've heard enough. Commander Fletcher's theoretical net might work in laboratory conditions, but in the real-world, submarines don't politely swim into nets and wait to be caught. They ram them at full power. They use explosive charges. They have cutters precisely designed to defeat this sort of obstacle. Approving this ridiculous design would be negligent. The Admiralty rejected Fletcher's proposal in February 1942. Standard heavy nets would continue to be installed at all major facilities, but Fletcher had one advantage his critics didn't know about. As commander of harbor defenses for the Clyde anchorage, he controlled a discretionary budget for experimental improvements to defense installations. It wasn't enough to purchase nets through official channels. However, there were 8 fishing trawler companies operating out of Glasgow whose businesses had been ruined by the war. They had fabrication equipment, wire rope, and men who knew how to work with marine nets. Fletcher quietly began purchasing materials. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Battle of the Atlantic. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about submarine net defenses before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II naval engineering and tactics, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the technical details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. March 1942. The Firth of Clyde stretched dark and cold under overcast skies. Fletcher stood on the deck of a converted fishing trawler, watching his crew lower the first section of his modified net into position. 3 months of clandestine work had produced 2,400 feet of experimental netting, enough to create a layered defense across the narrowest approach to the Clyde anchorage. The net hung from simple steel drum floats, nothing like the massive timber bulks of standard installations. The mesh was 3/8-inch flexible wire rope, woven into 6-foot squares instead of the standard 12. At 45 tons for the complete installation, Fletcher's system weighed less than a single section of conventional netting. His crew, merchant seamen and fishermen, rather than Royal Navy ratings, worked with practiced efficiency. They understood nets in ways naval personnel never would. Old hands who'd hauled herring nets in North Sea gales for 20 years knew how water moved, how wire rope behaved under strain, how to read the subtle signals that meant equipment was about to fail. Governor pressure set at 80 pounds per square inch on both winches, reported Chief Petty Officer McLeod, a former Aberdeen trawler captain. She'll start feeding at 60% of failure load, just like you specified. Fletcher nodded. The rendering winches were the key. When a submarine hit the net, the winches would gradually release cable under hydraulic control, letting the net envelope the submarine rather than creating a rigid barrier the U-boat could cut or ram through. What happened next? No one could predict with certainty. But Fletcher's calculations suggested that a submarine traveling at 6 knots would generate roughly 8,000 pounds of force against the net. The hydraulic governors would start yielding at 5,000 pounds, progressively releasing cable while the fine mesh wrapped around the submarine's dive planes, rudder, and propeller shaft. In theory. The installation was completed on March 22nd. Fletcher filed the appropriate paperwork describing it as experimental modifications to existing defensive positions approved under local command authority. Technically true, if misleading. For 4 weeks, nothing happened. Convoys entered the Clyde without incident. U-boat activity seemed concentrated farther south, off Liverpool and in the western approaches. Fletcher began to wonder if his net would ever face a real test. Then, on the night of April 25th, 1942, everything changed. U-438, a Type 7C submarine under the command of Kapitän Leutnant Heinrich Heinsohn, had been stalking convoy on 92 for 3 days. The convoy had scattered after a Wolfpack attack in mid-Atlantic, cost them 4 freighters and a tanker. HMS Volunteer, the lone escort destroyer that survived the battle, was shepherding 7 remaining merchantmen toward the Clyde. Heinsohn knew the British playbook. Exhausted escorts relaxed their vigilance approaching port. Merchant captains, believing themselves safe, allowed their ships to bunch up. The approaches to major harbors offered target-rich environments with multiple escape routes. At 22:40 hours, U-438 entered the Firth of Clyde on the surface, running on diesel engines at 8 knots. Visibility was less than 100 yards in heavy fog. Heinsohn had penetrated British coastal waters twice before. He knew exactly where the standard heavy submarine nets were positioned, marked clearly on German naval charts updated monthly by intelligence from aerial reconnaissance. This time, however, the charts were wrong. At 2253 hours, lookouts aboard the patrol trawler HMT Sycamore detected diesel engine noise bearing 270 degrees. Before they could issue a challenge, the submarine dove. Heinsohn ordered standard crash dive procedure. U-438's bow tilted down 15 degrees. Ballast tanks flooded. The submarine slid beneath the surface at a depth angle designed to take her under the known net positions at 80 feet. She never made it. At 2254 hours, U-438's bow struck Fletcher's net at 55 feet depth, traveling at 6 knots. The submarine's momentum carried her forward. The rendering winches immediately began feeding cable, their hydraulic governors hissing as they released tension. But the net wasn't parting. It was wrapping. 3/8-inch wire mesh, far too fine to cut with standard bow shears, snagged on the submarine's dive planes. As U-438 continued forward, more net material fed out from the winches, enveloping the boat. Within 30 seconds, wire rope had fouled the starboard diving plane, wrapping around its mounting bracket. The plane jammed in the 15-degree down position. Both planes to rise, emergency surface. Heinsohn's command came too late. The port dive plane was now tangled as well, locked in the dive position. U-438's automatic systems responded to the jammed planes by blowing ballast tanks. But with both planes forcing the nose down and 200 feet of net now wrapped around the hull, the submarine couldn't surface. She began to sink. Emergency blow all tanks. All back full. U-438's propeller churned in reverse, but the net was already fouling the propeller shaft. Wire rope began wrapping around the spinning shaft, creating a high-pitched scream of tortured metal as the propeller blade tips shredded the wire. Within seconds, the shaft seized. The submarine's only means of propulsion was dead. Aboard HMT Sycamore, Fletcher's hydrophone operator tracked every sound. "Target is fouled, sir. Propeller is stopped. She's settling on the bottom." Fletcher grabbed the radio handset. "All patrol craft, converge on grid reference Clyde 77. Submarine trapped in net barrier. Repeat, submarine confirmed trapped. Prepare for possible surface blow." At 2312 hours, unable to surface and with air quality deteriorating rapidly, Heinsohn made the only decision available to him. He ordered emergency ballast blow and surfaced directly into the middle of Fletcher's patrol screen. 4 patrol trawlers and 2 motor torpedo boats surrounded U-438 within minutes. Searchlights blazed across the water, illuminating a submarine hopelessly entangled in wire mesh, unable to dive, unable to maneuver, her deck guns unmanned. Heinsohn surrendered his boat and 52 crew members without firing a shot. It took salvage crews 18 hours to cut U-438 free from Fletcher's net. But Fletcher barely had time to process the capture before the next submarine arrived. U-454 entered the Firth of Clyde 48 hours after U-438's capture, unaware that Heinsohn's submarine had been taken. German Naval Command in Lorient, France maintained strict radio silence protocols during patrol operations. U-454's commander, Kapitän Lieutenant Burkhard Hackländer, knew only that U-438 had been operating in the area and assumed Heinsohn had either departed or been sunk by destroyers. Hackländer used identical tactics to Heinsohn: surface approach in darkness, crash dive when challenged, pass beneath the known British net positions at 75-80 feet depth. At 0340 hours on April 27th, U-454 struck Fletcher's net under circumstances nearly identical to U-438's capture. Her dive planes fouled, her propeller shaft wrapped with wire mesh. Within 6 minutes, she was trapped on the bottom in 60 feet of water. This time, Fletcher's patrol boats detected the submarine before she surfaced. When Hackländer attempted his own emergency ballast blow at 0421 hours, he surfaced into a coordinated pattern of depth charges that forced an immediate surrender. The second capture in 3 days electrified British naval intelligence. Something unprecedented was happening in the Clyde. When Fletcher's after-action report reached Portsmouth, describing the modified net design and both successful captures, Captain Hathaway, the same officer who had dismissed Fletcher's proposal 2 months earlier, immediately dispatched a technical assessment team to Scotland. Commander Phillips, the materials research officer who had testified against Fletcher's design, led the investigation. His report, filed April 30th, 1942, reversed nearly every objection he had previously raised. Field examination of U-438 and U-454 reveals that both submarines were immobilized by Commander Fletcher's modified net design through a mechanism entirely different from standard anti-submarine netting. Standard nets attempt to create a physical barrier. Fletcher's system creates a progressive entanglement mechanism that exploits the submarine's own forward momentum to wrap mesh material around control surfaces and propulsion systems. The 3/8-inch wire rope, previously considered too light for submarine defense, proves nearly impossible to cut with standard German bow shears, which are designed to sever heavier cables. The 6-foot mesh spacing ensures that multiple wire strands contact the submarine simultaneously, creating redundant fouling points. Most significantly, the yielding characteristic of the rendering winches prevents the submarine from generating sufficient force to break free. Where rigid nets present a fixed resistance that submarines can defeat through ramming or cutting, this flexible system absorbs momentum while progressively tangling the target. Phillips' report included a startling calculation. Fletcher's net installation had cost $1,840, less than 1/7 the cost of equivalent standard netting. Installation time was 14 days versus 6 months. Maintenance requirements were minimal because the lighter weight generated far less strain on moorings and connections. The intelligence value of the captures extended beyond the submarines themselves. British interrogators discovered that German naval charts of British coastal defenses were remarkably accurate, updated monthly through aerial reconnaissance. U-boat commanders knew the precise locations of every major net installation around the British Isles. But those charts showed standard heavy nets with predictable depths and configurations. Fletcher's modified system, installed without fanfare and occupying positions not marked on German intelligence maps, had become an invisible defense. On May 2, 1942, the Admiralty issued Emergency Directive 43B. All harbor defense commanders are authorized to implement modified flexible net systems based on Commander Fletcher's Clyde installation. Standard nets at major installations will be supplemented with flexible barrier systems positioned forward of existing defenses. Materials allocation for flexible net production receives Priority 2 classification, equivalent to destroyer construction. The directive reached fleet units on May 3rd. On May 4th, U-569, approaching the Clyde using the same tactics that had worked for German submarines for months, became the third U-boat captured by Fletcher's nets in 8 days. Her commander, Oberleutnant Hans-Peter Hinch, reported after his capture that he had been completely unaware of any change to British defensive systems. His charts showed clear passage routes beneath the known British nets. Those charts were now obsolete. The impact of Fletcher's system cascaded through both the Royal Navy and the Kriegsmarine with remarkable speed. By August 1942, modified flexible net systems had been installed at 43 British ports and naval installations. German U-boat commanders, receiving reports of multiple submarines trapped in previously reliable hunting grounds, began avoiding coastal approaches entirely. The number of merchant vessels sunk within 10 miles of British harbors dropped from 47 in the first 4 months of 1942 to 3 in the last 8 months. Convoy On 92, the same convoy that had led U-438 into Fletcher's net, proved to be a turning point in the larger Battle of the Atlantic. 7 merchant ships that survived the mid-ocean Wolfpack attack successfully delivered 42,000 tons of American war materials to Britain. Without Fletcher's defense system, German intelligence estimates suggested that at least 4 of those vessels would have been sunk at the harbor approaches, reducing the convoy's delivery to barely a third of its cargo. The flexible net concept spread rapidly beyond harbor defenses. The Royal Navy adapted Fletcher's design for protecting individual ships at anchor, using smaller sections that could be deployed quickly around capital ships, troop ships, and tankers. Fleet auxiliaries began carrying portable net sections that could be deployed in forward anchorages within hours rather than the months required for traditional installations. German naval intelligence identified the new net system by October 1942. U-boat command issued tactical bulletins warning submarine commanders about flexible mesh barriers and advising extreme caution when approaching British coastal installations. Several boats reported successful net penetrations using modified cutting equipment, but the psychological impact was severe. Submarine commanders who had previously viewed harbor approaches as target-rich environments now treated them as high-risk zones. Commander David Fletcher received promotion to captain in June 1942 and was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for innovative defensive systems that materially contributed to harbor security. He spent the remainder of the war commanding the Naval Research Section at Portsmouth, developing improved net designs and training harbor defense specialists. The 3 captured U-boats, U-438, U-454, and U-569, were recommissioned into Royal Navy service after thorough technical examination. U-438, redesignated HMS Graf, conducted war patrols against German shipping until 1944. Her capture yielded intelligence on German naval codes, submarine construction techniques, and tactical procedures that proved invaluable to British anti-submarine operations. Post-war analysis by both British and German naval historians confirmed that flexible net defenses prevented an estimated 60 to 70 submarine attacks on ships at harbor approaches between May 1942 and May 1945. Given that German submarines typically achieved a 40% hit rate in such attacks, Fletcher's system likely saved 25 to 30 merchant vessels, roughly 200,000 tons of shipping, from destruction. The concept influenced post-war naval mine and net defense doctrine in multiple nations. Modern harbor defense systems still employ variations of Fletcher's yielding barrier principle, though using advanced materials like Kevlar and Kevlar-reinforced steel cable instead of simple wire rope. Captain Hathaway, The Admiralty officer who initially rejected Fletcher's proposal wrote in his 1947 memoir, "I was comprehensively wrong, and the Royal Navy was fortunate that Commander Fletcher possessed both the technical insight and the moral courage to proceed despite official rejection." Innovation in warfare rarely comes from making existing systems stronger. It comes from seeing the problem differently. The established wisdom held that stopping a 750-ton submarine required brute strength, heavier cables, more rigid structures, greater resistance. That wisdom had been forged in World War I and refined through 2 decades of peacetime theorizing by men who knew engineering but had never faced a real submarine in combat conditions. Fletcher understood something those men didn't, that strength and rigidity could become weaknesses. A rigid barrier presents a fixed target for cutting equipment, for ramming, for explosive charges. But a flexible system that yields under attack, that uses the enemy's momentum against him, that progressively entangles rather than rigidly blocks, that system exploits the fundamental physics of the situation rather than fighting them. The 3 U-boats caught in Fletcher's nets in April and May 1942 represented more than tactical victories. They demonstrated that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem isn't more force, but different thinking. 400 feet of wire mesh, deployed in a way that contradicted every established principle of submarine net defense, proved more effective than the massive installations that cost fortunes and took months to build. Not because it was stronger, but because it was smarter. The submarine commanders who surrendered their boats to Fletcher's design weren't defeated by superior technology. They were defeated by a harbor defense officer who refused to accept that the only way to stop a submarine was the way it had always been done before. Sometimes the most heroic thing an engineer can do is trust the calculations when everyone else demands conventional solutions. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.